Hello. Um,
Hello.
Welcome to this little video conversation between myself, Darby Minott Bradford, and David Chariandy, acclaimed writer of fiction and nonfiction, which we'll be talking about a little bit today. Books that are, I guess, being relaunched in Quebec as translations, but the translations were from a few years ago, I believe. Um, yeah, it's good to be here with you. I'm coming from Chachage, Montreal, unceded Guinea-Gahaga territory, and you're joining me from Vancouver, right?
Yeah,
Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh territory.
absolutely. You know
Um,
it. Yeah,
yeah, I spent a bit of time in Vancouver, so you get to know these things.
it's great. Yeah,
Yeah, it's good to be in the room with you.
it's great
Uh,
to be in the room with you. And I have to
yeah,
say, thank you for your patience. The people watching this might not know, but I got the time mixed up a bit. But
yeah,
Darby and everyone else has been very, very forgiving. So thank you. And
yeah.
it's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, well, I mean, we it happens to the best of us, and yeah, it's kind of in keeping with the theme of this year's festival in a funny way, which is like time first and foremost.
Mm.
In the tree and the page, themes that I feel like these two books really touch on in some pretty meaty ways. Certainly with this intersection of memory and race and place and family in a couple of different ways, I believe. But to kind of launch us into a little conversation about them, I wondered if we might kind of touch on, I guess, this context that we're coming together around, which is to a certain degree translation, and the way that, like it or not, I would imagine it's something that you kind of forces you to take stock of the work all over again in a funny way, and forces you to look back on the novel, of course, which is, I guess, steeped in or is kind of in tension with a particular look back on a childhood, but also a relationship with a brother, a tragedy, and an injustice with a particular death. For those who haven't read the book, I won't go too deep into detail. You go as deep as you want to, but I'll hold off a little bit. And then a bit of a turn to the future with the idea maybe of a kind of chosen family that kind of pops up at the end, right? A kind of informal community that kind of congeals back together after splitting apart. But I'm curious in particular when I think about time and taking stock. With the book, This Letter to Your Daughter, with I've been meaning to tell you, which now it's been what, 7, 8 years since you wrote it,
Yes. Yeah.
maybe a little bit more since you started imagining it. Your daughter's in a different place. You're in a different place. The world is, in some ways, in a very different, but in some ways, in a very similar place. We're kind of reliving that moment in a funny way. Yeah, I wonder what it's like to kind of talk about these books now and to think back on the work, on the challenges, on the things that still feel very similar, some things that feel different.
Well, thank you. That is such a thoughtful and generous engagement with my books, and so I'm very grateful for that. You're not just scratching the surface. You're it's you've really we really thought about my work, and what an honor that is, Darby. Thank you. Um, I think the just thinking of a couple of the great points you raised, the issue of translation comes to me now that these two books are entering, um, uh, are being translated into French or and adjusted into Quebecois French. And what an honor it is to be published by Heliotrope and to have my books available in Quebec significantly for the first time. They were translated into French before, but by a Swiss publisher. It's harder to get the books in Quebec. Um, and so crossing language boundaries, but maybe also cultural and geographic boundaries. And I guess every time I've been lucky, every time my books, and especially Brother, has been translated into a new language, I do ask the question, um, what does this new culture make of what I had imagined to be a very specific story, specifically rooted story, corresponding to a specific culture and locale. And I guess that's, I don't have a good answer to that. I really don't. But um, when I've been lucky enough to go to the country in which my book has been translated, the language into which my book has been translated, I do ask people that question and ask how has this question resonated here? What makes this book of any interest at all? I ask that question to anyone who reads my book, frankly. But it's another question, I think, when I think it's a different context. And so yeah, that's the one of the things that kind of excites me of thinking ahead to the festival. Maybe hearing from an audience member or two about why that why this book might be of interest.
Yeah, it's an interest. I mean, it's interesting to hear an author be so aware, I guess, of that question that it's not just transitioning something into a different linguistic space, but it's also a different cultural context.
Hmm.
And I feel in a strange way, I mean, these books feel like a very familiar space from someone who grew up in Montreal, grew up in a complicated kind of racial and cultural mishmash in a certain sense, grew up in a racially diverse household. Um, and it feels also there's something about the letter to your daughter that I feel like I've seen a number of books that have tried to hit a similar mark in French. So I think it's a kind of familiar tradition, which I feel like there's been a number of these kind of letter books in recent years. So I'm interested to see how these Quebec audiences um, are gonna respond because I think they will. But it'll be interesting when you're in town and we're talking with Katia and also with Liliana, the Mapuche poet, who will be joining us for a conversation about translation and this exact question of cultural spaces. But I wondered if without going too deep into the personal, in a more personal sense, I mean, there's such a heavy lift with, I've been meaning to tell you, in terms of kind of a time capsule, some kind of a little optimistic time machine that this is a moment that you're taking to look back and be like, kind of like, this is what I've gathered. This is what I kind of understand for myself, but also having lots of humility that your daughter both needs and has a right to make up her own mind about this stuff.
Hmm.
And now that it's been these few years down the road and she's a young adult, I imagine she might be still in school. She may have be living her own life outside of the household. I don't know. Yeah. What do you feel that you do differently now if you had to kind of write a somewhat different letter, but in another cultural moment, like I said earlier, that kind of has a lot of the similar issues and challenges to it.
That's a great question again, Darby. There's one, I guess, note of correspondence between the moment in which I wrote I've been meaning to tell you. When I wrote it, it is to, it was to a 13-year-old, then to a 13-year-old child. Um, One of the things that prompted the book, even though, the question of who we are, the question of racial prejudice, the question of xenophobia. These have long histories, and they don't just these are issues and problems that don't just correspond to a particular moment. It was, and the book makes this very explicit. It was part of the occasion for writing the book was the first election of Donald Trump, and my daughter being watching for the first time a national election, watching the election of the most powerful political figure in the world and being very puzzled by the things that could come out of such a person's mouth. And so the obvious correspondence is here we are again in a different time, um, but with another symbolic moment. I call it symbolic, not because there's something, at least from my perspective, profoundly exceptional about this moment of borders and race relations and a fear of the other and a demonization of all kinds of minorities, queer people, trans people, women, racial minorities, migrants, refugees. Um, Here we are again. And I think the one thing that I don't know if I got it right. The one thing that I tried to do in the book was to, as you said, and again, I appreciate this kindness, to adopt a tone of humility, not to say this is the world and this is how you should understand the world, but this is how I understand the world. This is my story. Um, this is how I've thought and felt about the what I've experienced, in the hope, as you've said, that my daughter will tell uh, her own story. I'm now, coincidentally, or not, writing a letter to my younger child, and
Mm,
they are growing up in they are now 18, just turned 18.
okay.
And they're growing up in a different context and with different questions foremost in their mind. And again, what I write cannot be a story that will allow them to make sense of their lives, their body, their place in the world. It can only be a story of love and a story, I think, and this is maybe another thing. Maybe this is the only thing I got right that I feel in I've been meaning to tell you. And I maybe that's putting it a bit too uh, 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 wrong, but maybe the thing that pleases me the most is that there is a sense of a sense of articulating how we fail ourselves and our loved ones in the midst of
Mm,
uh, caring for them, loving them, and maybe, as in the writing process itself, trying to fail better the next time. Um, uh, that's
yeah.
what I'm thinking about now as I write this new book, and it connects me to this.
Yeah. It's interesting because I inevitably had a question, which I decided not to ask because it's a bit of it feels almost like a gotcha question of like, why your daughter? Why not your other child? Right. Or why not
Mhm.
both of them?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Obviously your second kid does feature and they have this moment in school that features pretty prominently and that kind of I think unpacks something you just said, this whole idea of like sitting on the floor with them and both of them looking to you for some obvious visible reason as to what do I do with a moment like this in my life,
Yes.
and you not quite having the words in the moment to you have the words to put it for yourself maybe, but you're also maybe trepidatious about how am I going to put it to them? Because they're going to have their context is slightly different. Their context is in a different time and space, and you have to be careful because it's really easy to take a misstep. You know.
Absolutely. And there's always the question of, and again, this might be the paradoxical, for me, the small paradoxical success of the book. Every book is a small paradoxical success, perhaps.
Mm,
And that is, I articulated um, again, the hesitation, the difficulty in finding the right words, perhaps in moments, the impossibility of finding the right words, and only through a form of reflection afterwards do we make sense of the moments in which we have lived. Um,
yeah, yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about the idea of failing your family because in a strange way, I think it brings us back to brother, which I think is engaging that tension in a kind of different way. But I wondered a place where I feel like people aren't um, quite as in tension with what could have been or what can't quite be in Brother is the Rouge, right? This kind of like somehow liminal space where And I appreciate the acknowledgement that you're like, you're not entering a space that's brand new. It's not magical in that way. You can't claim it as your own as if it was never anybody else's. It's kind of no one's space. And certainly maybe as settlers, it's certainly not our space, even as settlers of color. But but there's something different going on there where you get to be black in a way that isn't defined by whiteness, right? You get to be a person of color in a way that isn't defined by otherness. And all of the characters kind of have this connection to it, right? The mom is like showing them things when they're kids, and they get to be with each other, Francis and Michael, in a way that they don't really get to be with each other elsewhere, maybe. And then in the latest book, and I've been meaning to tell you, we get there's the contact with your own kind of trepidatiousness about the beach and these kind of like natural getaway, very Canadian ideas about like stepping into nature and how natural that is, right? And your daughter who kind of takes to that much more naturally. Um, I feel like there's a question somewhere in there about how to reach a space where you get to be yourself, which is maybe the big question of I've been meaning to tell you, but maybe also in a strange way, brother. Um, and also, yeah, this idea of the space where you're safe to try and maybe fail, maybe not fail, but maybe that's not necessarily the dichotomy or the binary that you're engaging with. Like, how did you come upon that? Like, it's a little bit more obvious in a kind of biographical way in I've been meaning to tell you, but in Brother, I wonder how you, especially as someone that then later on, reading these in tandem, doesn't necessarily have an affinity for the kind of like, the Don Valley kind of experience per se. How did you come upon that idea of the Rouge as a place where maybe they escape certain things?
Um, I think in a very simple way, it was one space of escape for me growing up.
Yeah.
And I wanted to I wanted to honor that, testify about that sense. But I think as you've already done, complicate what it means to belong to the natural world and to indigenous land. Um, I guess in I've been meaning to tell you the fact that it is indigenous land named specifically is there, and I've been meaning to tell you. In Brother, it's an interesting question that I had, an interesting writer's question, which is when I grew up, I was not taught it was indigenous land. To imagine how 4 decades ago a child would know, be able to name the nations um, on which the child lived, seemed to me untruthful in a sense. Had to be truthful to the ignorance. But in the Rouge, nevertheless, and I think this is a very real feeling that we understood. I believe this is the kind of language of it. We understood that this was not our land.
Yeah.
And that's a complicated knowing. That's because we were made to feel that it was not our land, but also I think a deeper sense that the city itself did not belong in an uncomplicated way there as well. I guess I wanted to do both of those things in Brother, and I guess the Rouge, in the novel Brother, functions as a space of escape, another space, a space where one is not subject to the same gaze. One can reimagine oneself perhaps in a certain way. And we know that the task of imagining ourselves is not an innocent task. We're constantly negotiating how others read us, even as we define ourselves positively. We're fending off sometimes these outwardly readings of ourselves that are oftentimes quite toxic and wrong and so forth. But maybe the Rouge offers a different space in which to do just that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a space where this carapace that you kind of
Mhm.
describe a little bit, and
Mhm.
I've been meaning to tell you, but that is like familiar in a bunch of ways with specifically the way Francis, I guess, is in the world.
Mhm.
Which maybe is a little doubled over with the ways you described that your brother was in the world as a teenager. This kind of impenetrability that I think is familiar to anyone that was raised certainly as a black boy or a boy of color. Um, I wonder, yeah, now that you're turning your attention to these questions that you maybe want to answer or that you want to spend time with trying to like, yeah, attempt the paradoxical success in answering for your second kid, who's now, just about an adult. So it's a slightly different moment, right? You can feel the
Mhm.
tension with your daughter, especially towards the end of the book, of she's getting to a point in her life where she's not going to turn to you.
Mhm.
She's going to turn to herself. She's going to turn to something outside of herself, but it might not be you. You're going to ask a question and she's just going to keep it to herself, maybe.
Mhm.
And it's a whole other stage when you jump ahead to 18. Um, and it's striking also that there's a sentence towards the end of the book where you mention, that there's which I had totally forgotten about, the first attempt at a trans ban in the military. And harassment and a couple of other things that you're like, oh, this could be about yesterday in a strange way, right? Um, what have been the challenges other than obviously the differentiations between the kids and the moment, but what have been the big challenges returning to this kind of project a second time?
Yeah, I think voice is the big challenge.
Hmm.
Uh, what I wrote, I've been meaning to tell you, it was authentically to a 13-year-old child. And for good and bad, and perhaps that's even the wrong way to speak about it, inevitably might be the way to speak about it. We speak to a 13-year-old beloved child in a different way that we might speak to, let's say, we might have a conversation. I think that's true. And I think um, the book is explicit about that. It's explicit about in so many ways. It's explicit about its addressee. Um, and so I think you're absolutely right. A 13-year-old is different from an 18-year-old. A 13-year-old then, even though there are continuities in political continuities and um, um, uh, there are differences. There are differences between what you voice to a 13-year-old and what you voice to an 18-year-old. And yeah, I think, again, my effort was not to censor what I feel, not to prettify what I feel. I'm speaking about the first book.
Yeah,
Um, to encode in a particular voice appropriate to a 13-year-old what I was thinking about, am still thinking about as an adult who has thought, I think, significantly about these questions, and to somehow um, involve a certain sophistication of thought into um, an address to a 13-year-old. It's a kind of a tall order, I think. And again, that's what made that book a kind of a challenge, a real challenge to write. I mean, a simple way of putting it is to be truthful to me as much as to be caring and honoring of the relationship I have as a parent of a 13-year-old. That's different, I think, from the relationship between a parent, an adult, and another adult.
yeah,
Adult who has, as you've pointed out with my daughter, and this is true with my second child, um, people who are now have a lot of experience, can and do. school me on the world. And it's very, very, very true. It's they teach me and correct me about my position in the world, my uninterrogated assumptions, my subtle biases. Um, and so I think this second book will involve that, but I actually think that process of mutual learning was there in the first book too. But again, I think voice. How do you speak to a young one? When do you speak to a young one? When do you opt for silence and then later regret that silence? All of these things were there in the first book.
Yeah. And maybe to leave it on this point, when do you regret speaking? Which I think that tentativeness is also there. I can't help but think of my own experiences growing up and never to like great damage per se, but certainly with some complications involved. The things that, my black father, my white mother had in mind for me,
Mhm.
that didn't quite line up because our contexts are just slightly different, in ways that can sometimes be like quite meaningful. Um,
Absolutely. I hope
yeah,
this isn't the very end of the thing. Is it possible to? I just wanted to ask what you're working
sure.
on.
Yeah.
I missed a chance to see you when you were in Vancouver, and now I'm blanking on when that was. Um,
Would have been last fall, like not this fall, but 23, fall
yeah, yeah,
2023
yeah.
would have
Okay,
been last time I was
that
there.
makes sense. I was actually in Vancouver. Last fall I wasn't in Vancouver, but I was in Vancouver then, and I
Yeah.
remember explicitly missing that opportunity. Do you have a new book in the works or coming out?
I actually have a new translation that's coming out in a few weeks. A
Oh, wow.
translation of called Ring of Dust of a book by Louise Magloire called Trêve, which is kind of about strange, kind of like bad, but really lush queer relationship stuff. And it's kind of an oddly opaque book. It's very um, kind of like these gestures of revelation, but that also kind of have an opacity to them. So there's always a
Oh,
bit of a like showing yourself but hiding yourself going on. It was a ton of fun to translate, and it's a really kind of expansive book. So I really kind of sink my teeth into it.
it's
But
amazing.
I'm actually currently working on a book about I guess the idea of home, the idea of housing, the idea of the privileges and faints and middle-agedness that goes into buying property, which is something I did
Oh,
recently that I didn't
wow.
really think I was going to do until suddenly we were doing it.
Right.
Um, and just this kind of like, yeah, mind warp that I think comes with that, especially when you're an artist in the world, especially when you think of yourself as a point of resistance, and then suddenly you find yourself in the instruments of capitalism in a major way. And what does that say about you? What does that say about race in your life? What does that say about your communities? What does that say about your queerness? All of that stuff kind of wrapped into one.
It's very interesting, and speaking even generationally in terms of Black people,
Yeah.
there's a whole kind of sense among some Black people of kind of, especially of the working Black people, that of home ownership as the route route to a kind of more stable life, the entry into the middle class and
Yeah.
entry into and even with the critique that I'm sure we share about capitalism, about the concept of private property in the broadest sense, it is this um, it has been functioned as this very real means by which um, previous generations of Black people have understood a pathway to a better life, whether or not that's been achieved.
Yeah, whether or not that's been achieved is a key part for sure. But also, it's a funny thing, and it's very much, I think, as much as I think it was different, say, from my grandmother
Mhm.
when she bought a tiny house on a 55-year mortgage.
Mhm.
I think it speaks to the crudeness of what this kind of financialized world is like when it's kind of like, well, keep trying your hand with precarity and landlords, or try
Right.
your hand with precarity and property. you
Right,
know,
right. That's it. Yeah,
uh,
and the kind of predatory kind of lending practices, especially in the States
yeah,
and other.
yeah,
No, you're absolutely. It sounds really really important. I love books like that. I love books that are about a critical mind, sharpened critical mind, looking at our imbrication in uninnocent circumstances, looking at
yeah,
the complications, the genuine complications under which we live. Yeah,
and continue in a way that I think you point to really eloquently with, I think, attempting to do it for your kids, but also I think somewhere in there, there's a story of you attempting to do it for yourself, reconciling all these different social intersections and cultural intersections with just how should a person like me be in the world,
absolutely,
what's
absolutely
what's the what's the solution for me in this very non-monolithic way, but that's fully entangled at the same time,
entangled. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. Anyhow, thanks for that little moment. It's
I
nice to
know.
speak. Yeah. um, yeah, thanks for joining me. And
No,
you'll
I
be
thank
you'll be
you.
joining me again at the end of the month, so I can't wait for the continuation of this.
Yeah, I really can't wait for that. And thank you again. You can always sense when an interviewer has number one read the book and then number one read it with care and with the kind of understanding, a kind of a specific understanding. And so I really am really grateful that you've done that. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. Folks can join us on April 26th. That's when we'll be joined by Katya and Liliana Ancolao for our conversation about translation and all these different cultural divides that are hard to bridge under normal circumstances, let alone when you throw in indigeneity or race or queerness, all kinds of different things that are different in different cultural spaces. And I think that's important to remember.
For sure.
But the festival runs April 24th to 27th of this year in Montreal. People coming from all over the world. And this lovely video, along with some other ones, will be online April 14th. So check out the other materials. And
Well,
thanks again, David, for joining me.
thank you.
Timelines and all that notwithstanding.
Thank you, Darby. Thank you for the thoughtfulness of the interview and your patience getting me here. And I'm really looking forward to the festival. And
Yeah,
last little thing, little plug. I wanted to say
sure.
it's really really so honored that Malika Abdul Mumin wrote the introduction to
Yeah.
the
Yeah, yeah,
edition.
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
really
really lovely.
really really lovely thing. Again, just a joy to be read with such care again.
Great. All right. Cheers, folks.
Take care.